each of us individually, if you think of it as like a row of houses, and each one has a garden out front and, like you said, landscaping and all that. I wonder if some people just have like a longer front yard, like a bigger space where you can come way in and see more. So if you're an artist and you're making art, that space represents like a pretty large playground for people to come in.
Welcome to the At Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. The ways we move into and out of one another's lives, the modality of relationship, as it were, is a matter of art. I resonate deeply with Seth Godin's definition of art as anything that facilitates human connection, including, in my own iteration of that same definition, a relationship with oneself. For nearly 2 decades, Sandra McCracken, my guest on this episode, has been making music that not only facilitates human connection, but she's done so with a particularly thoughtful attentiveness. And in our conversation, we consider whether or not it's that connection, that attentiveness and thoughtfulness that actually makes art sacred, rather than art in a particular setting or with a particular use. Check it out. So, hey, you're off the road for a stretch.
Yes, I am. I feel like kind of settling back into normal life with family, and the kids are just like flourishing. I think we're all three flourishing in that, been in a groove of Advent stuff and trying to take some deep breaths. This December, I don't know if it's because I've been following the church calendar for a few years now, but I start to feel those rhythms change. And there's something to that that's like, I look forward to it, and I just really love Advent. It has a way of being spacious, as and joyful, even though it kind of has some somber, expectant.
You feel like that comes from like the actual, for you, that kind of gets exposed by following the church calendar? And what do you mean when you say like you've been following the church calendar for a few years, for someone who would have no idea what that meant?
Yeah.
Tell me what that means. Yes. And then like you seem to be saying like, I'm following the church calendar, I've been doing this for a few years, and because of that I'm having this kind of different experience, specifically the season of Advent. Can you break that down a little bit? Like decode that?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, I think so. I've been going to a church for, I guess it's been 4 years, that follows a calendar where the new year starts. Basically, the new year starts at just after Thanksgiving, when Advent starts. So that's like when the calendar rolls over into the new year. And so I have noticed as we practice as a church, kind of going through these different seasons of the year. So that's like the beginning, and then Easter is another high point. Just before Easter, there's another stretch of time like called Lent that's also similar to Advent, where it's like waiting and there's quietness and there's a little bit of like restraint on, sometimes people give things up for a period of time, or all that stuff. It's like practicing these things not because they earn us something, but because they form something in our affections. Feels like I'm just kind of carried along by it, and I don't think I came into that practice with a lot of excitement. Like I didn't really care either way. But as I've been around this community and we've been doing that, it's not like I went looking for that. It just feels like I stepped into it and I tried it on.
Because those were the people you were wanting to be around, and they were living a particular way.
Exactly. And I think as I've tried it on, then I realized it started to shape kind of the ebb and flow of my emotional life, my spiritual life as well. And I don't think there's like one way to do that. I don't think it's like, oh, this is a better way. But for me, I have found that it's been a real anchor to this year, to remember, oh man, last year, December was so, I felt like I was able to reflect and to take stock of what I'd like to change, what has been working, what do I want, where am I going? And asking God for vision and clarity around those things. Yeah. And I think that's happening again this year, and it's been really, it's kind of fun to see it leading me in a sense,
Yeah. Well, there's sort of the two ways I think I think you and I have even talked about this in the past, that when it comes to spiritual practices, there's there's a season in which, or seasons in and out of which, like we sort of hold our practices, and there's the things that we do, and then there are other seasons in which those practices actually really do hold us. And part of what you're discovering or talking about is specifically in this season, at the tail end of a lot of business, that the practice of Advent actually kind of holds you in place and gives you the ability to reflect in a way that you might not be able to without. The practice is holding you.
Yeah, that's a clear way to say it. I think that's really true. In the trees, oh, I hear you on your knees, and you can fly, or you can stay in the wild, or in the pain. You can wait, resist.
You actually drew this distinction a second ago when you talked about getting back into normal life. Do you, that's a really interesting phrase to use.
Sorry, I didn't filter that.
No, what? So, is there for you, like, is there a line? Because like you were on the road. You traveled a ton this fall.
I did,
which is great professionally.
Yeah.
Is there kind of a gap there right now between like your professional life and your personal life, and like there's normality and then there's professionalism? Like, what's that about?
Yeah, I feel like it's like swings. It's like these swings where, it's funny that I didn't really mean to call it normal, but
I'm glad I caught you.
Feel like there's, you caught me. There is a, I mean, man, the last 2 weeks. So I've been home for 2 weeks at this stretch, and I probably got to a point, and I did this last year, and I probably did this the year before that, but like after the really busy season of fall, which I think is true for a lot of us. It's not just in music. Sorry, I'm sitting outside. You're getting all the East Nashville goodness.
It's great.
The buses going by.
We'll just call it production. We're adding production value to this.
Yes, that's right. It's like, that reminds me of Sesame Street for some reason.
It really does. She was actually outside. There was a real bus.
Who are the people in your neighborhood?
Oh dear.
I don't know if you remember that song.
Oh, I definitely do.
So anyway, so in the last 2 weeks after I got home and kind of plugged back into the rhythms with my kids and I feel more human. I feel more flourishing and more deep breaths. And I think at the age that my kids are, they're 8 and 10. There's a different kind of attentiveness that's not required, but definitely invited. It's great when I can be attentive to them, and it takes time to be present long enough to realize what are the questions to ask and what are the needs that come to the surface for all of us. And so I think that does feel like that's the baseline. And then when I go out and travel and I go play a show, there's real fulfillment, and it feels really meaningful when I'm able to offer songs and stories and conversation with people. And so it's really, I think that there's a calling to go out and do that, and then to come back and reconnect with that baseline and with my community here. And the back and forth of that can be pretty taxing, just from resources and realizing, man, none of us can do all the things. I think we're in a culture that's just where it's hard to say no, it's hard to carve out boundaries. And on one hand, like, the gospel opens up a place for us where there's abundance, where there's 12 baskets left over.
Right.
And I think we offer that, but then you see Jesus' pattern and habits of rest, where he would withdraw from people and he would take time for prayer and to be with his Father, and to, and he's already in union with his Father, right?
Right.
So there's no break in their union at that point, but he still would withdraw to recharge. And I think the rhythms of going out and coming back and going out and coming back are just, it takes some management skills, and it takes some recalibration, like kind of a life of recalibration, like, ooh, that was too much. Okay. And then recalibrating, and then like, okay, I think I've got room to be available for this for this friend today, or for this neighbor, or for taking a meal to somebody.
Yeah.
That you want to have space to where you can be attentive to those things.
And there are
Even
a
just
couple of things that
prayer,
are
like
really interesting there, insofar as like the 12 baskets that are left over, like
yeah,
those, like there's an abundance that's left over after, in a sense, being like asked to overextend yourself, right? I mean, there's like,
yeah,
here's a task that
yeah,
is too much for you, and then on the other
yeah.
side of the thing
Like
that is too much for you, then there's more than you knew that there was of you on the other side of that.
yeah, yeah. I really think the only exception. So in the state that we live in, like where we're in between Jesus coming and his coming back, in the state or time that we live in, the only exception for where we don't experience limitations is in communion with the Holy Spirit. Like when we take time for prayer and to pour out our hearts before God, like the Psalms invite us to do, like pour out your hearts before him. I think that is the only place that I have found where there's no boundary. Like we can't exhaust his attention for us, his love for us, his wanting to hear about our day and about the things that are going on, about the concerns. And I think when I am able to withdraw like that and have time for like really prayer, and not just prayer, but like listening prayer, I feel like in those moments, time seems to stretch out and multiply like the 12 baskets. And I feel like it fills me up in a way that enables me to go out and spend some more. And I think yeah, and that can happen whether I'm on the road or at home.
Right.
And then as I've like tasted more of that, I think I desire more of it and realize that that's the place where the abundance is coming from, and where the supply is, where the wellspring that keeps on nourishing me and nourishing us and offering what we really need, not just like superficial needs, but deep needs.
Each time before I waited for a change. Time and again, translucent I remain. Now I am awake. You could not reciprocate my love. Reciprocate.
Which kind of like plays around a little bit with what we mean by when you're talking about going out and coming back and going out and coming back, and some of what is meant by like, or as understood as home, or like what does back mean?
Yeah.
Like what exactly do I mean by
question.
home? Like what do you? And so for you, in terms of the out and back, I mean, this is you've been on the road off and on. You've been traveling professional singer, songwriter, storyteller for going on 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And there have been places that you return to constantly that maybe feel a little bit more like home. Can you talk a little bit about then, like when you talk about the sort of out and back and places of rest, or home for you has changed over the last few years, what that means to be a home and to find a home? What's your experience of home? Like, are there places that are like when you are out and you're 2,000 miles from Nashville, Tennessee, that feel like home, that are replenishing, or is it like you have to be geographically in a particular place in order to feel rested? What's that look like for you?
Well, that's a good question. I think home is people. Like home is like kind of having this nucleus of family and belonging that sometimes, it's actual, blood relationships, like our family. But then in other ways, I think it's the connection, kind of that mystic connection that we have through people that God binds us up in life with. And, we have to build toward that and strengthen the fabric of our lives together, but I think that's what creates home. And in all the travel and, on one hand, I've been in the same house for 13 years, and I've lived in Nashville for more than 20. So there is like an actual place geographically that I think I've poured a lot into, and those investments have have been fruitful. It does give me a sense of belonging.
The
But
the actual specific geographical, here's where home is, I have an address.
yeah, a
That part
little
of it.
bit. There's something to be said for that. And I think it's also given me wings to go out and travel other places and to enjoy that because there is a home base. But as far as feeling tethered, I think I actually feel tethered to people. So if I'm in Scotland, like a couple weeks ago, I was in Scotland and I was really homesick. My mom was not feeling well and had been in the hospital, and it was like the feeling of homesickness around that was not around an address or a geography. It was around people and wanting to be close. And to feel the stretch of that then makes me so grateful to get back. Like, I feel like I bond pretty deeply when I travel with the people that I'm around. It's just amazing to see how we're all like, there are just these points of connection, especially within church communities, and just the way how hospitable people are. And it's enriching to go out and experience that, but then to come back to your home community and to feel tethered there, I think is
Yeah.
it does enhance flourishing.
What are you called? What is your natural place? What is your name? Where did you fall? Where have you hidden away? Feeling so brave. Oh, I hear you in the trees, in the trees. Oh, I hear on your knees, and you.
And so far as part of what you're talking about is extending then, like having a sense of home in being tethered to or connected to or rooted with people.
Yeah.
And you're extending that to folks who aren't as tethered to you, or you aren't as tethered to when you're out on the road. One of the I guess tensions, balances, struggles, one of the questions for specifically performing, well, not as a singer-songwriter per se, but like anyone who's a public type figure, is like where the line is between, I almost want to talk about, like, there's sort of like oversharing, and then there's like being impersonal, and
Yeah.
because you want to give of yourself, you want that to be authentic, you want that to be very real, because that's what connects with people, and that's why they show up, and that's why they care about what you do. But then there's like, how often are you talking about your kids, and how often do you get in like for you, do you have a metric by which you navigate like how much of yourself, your history, your life, you're extending? Is it a matter of how much, or is it a matter of degrees? Like, how do you navigate the sort of the sharing of your person through art versus, I don't know, maybe being overextended or overexposed, or is there an overexposed for you?
Yeah. That is a kind of I think that also is a thing I'm trying to learn and keep tabs on. On one hand, my instinct is like I have a real desire for connection and for collaboration. So even if I'm leading a workshop, I don't really just want to hear myself talk. I want to like engage with people and
Right.
hear where they're coming from, because I think
Yeah.
it's just way more interesting,
Yeah.
and hearing from each other, and the surprise of not knowing what anybody's going to say next, and then we bounce off of each other in that collaborative mode. But I think I'm still learning, and I have new awareness around that, the limitations of that. Like, I can't share. I think I'm also kind of private, and there's the privacy, and there's wanting to protect my kids in that. And social media is a kind of a strange thing that you have to figure out.
You mean
What to
specifically with the
share and
relationship
what.
to like your family and personal life stuff, social media?
Yeah, and I've had some resistance of. I think I've tried to be a little bit more protective of that part. Like, I'll share things anecdotally, both in a written format, um, and then just very selectively, more in like that I will share more in depth with an individual or with a few
Right.
individuals when I'm traveling. And I have to kind of feel safe around that.
Yeah.
and usually that's okay. And I think I want to maintain the ability to trust people and to trust that like there are times to share and to connect um and but I think that it is it's kind of a different world because of the ability we have to reach each other through phones and various handles,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So it's like a whole lot of, I mean, I think about how do we tell our kids that when they get to the point of having their own personal devices, and it's like, man, there's a lot to teach. There's a lot it's kind of a jungle.
Yeah.
So, but I would say like, there's not a hard, fast rule around it for me. And I think a lot of it's just trying to trust the spirit I've felt, as I've been single for about 4 years, after being married for a long time, I found that there's, in being single, there's a space that's created that's less protected. And I've had to really learn about that kind of quickly. Like, oh, that my emotional openness puts me in a situation where people want to step into that space, not romantically necessarily, just in general.
Yeah.
There's more availability when you're, a single woman who's like, to be single and to be nurturing, where I have kids and I'm like naturally want to like care for people and hear and listen and pray for them. It's like it may not be appropriate to pray for people in a lot of different situations, even though of course you want to pray for people, but there's an intimacy to that I think is worth protecting.
Does that feel like a loss to you? Does it feel like a step back? Does it like, is there or is that just that's what
I think it's growth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's just a landscape change. So one is not better than the other, but I had to learn because I was so unaware that being married had given me boundaries. So then I had to assert new boundaries, or in my case I had to pray like, Lord, help me to kind of shore up these edges so that I can offer myself to people in a genuine way, but not too much, so it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's something I've thought a lot about this last year.
It's sort of where the line, because it's not really a line, and that's part of what you and I are probably both saying is like, it's not like there's this line, oh, here's the big black line, got it, found it, located it, now I know how to navigate. It's a continual navigation. It's almost like, and this is a terrible analogy, but it's like, I mean, insofar as navigation, it's a little bit more like being at sea and you're really trying to avoid like landmines, or not landmines, but these sort of like these little explosive devices somewhere that are hidden in the water, or something that might puncture a hole. And it's not like it's on that side of this line on the map. It's like, well, you can be on that side of that line on the map, but you still have to be really cautious of these things that might blow a hole in your hull. Like, so in a sense, they're sort of everywhere, but they're not everywhere.
The water thing is what came to me. I mean, just 2.5 weeks ago, I was spending some time with this idea, and even the connection between sharing and relationship and how much is too much and all that. I was thinking about that even in the context of like, what does it mean to hold our edges and our identity? Like to say, okay, you want to eat at this restaurant, I want to eat here. That's the basic superficial version of identity. But the deeper part of that is like, who am I and where do I stop and you begin? And so when we're in community, that is a really, like you said, it's not a line. But the image that came to mind as I was praying about it was the image of a shore and the tide coming in, and that looking out at the edge of a shore where the tide is moving daily, and it's moving back and it's moving forward, but that you clearly see this is the land and this is the sea. And I think it's more like that. Like the Lord kind of makes our edges, and he does it gently, and he does it with movement and with grace and with it's kind of inviting. Like you could put your feet in the water up to a certain point, but at some point you're in over your head and you're, but so like this not a firm line, but like the edge of the waves.
It's more like God doesn't build levees. He forms ocean fronts.
Yeah, and he's okay with that because he has mastery over his own edges, and he, you know what I'm saying? Like he he knows who he is, and he invites us to say, like, this is my name for you. He invites us and names us, and then shows us, here's the edge. Here's where you here's the place where there's fullness, and then here's the place where you can share some, where you engage with the other person, where there's a porousness to the boundary.
Yeah.
I've heard somebody else talk about it in terms of, like, I was reading something, I'm trying to think of what it was, but talking about it as gates, and like each person has, this might have been like Henry Cloud talking about, each person has like a like a house with a yard and a property. And the idea is not to build these huge walls and we can't get into each other. Boundaries are not meant to be like the huge walls. They're meant to be like with gates and with like beautiful landscaping that invite you to join in and to come up on the lawn, but where there's a distinction between two neighbors, and it's not one property, it's two places. And I don't know how all that, I think there's a connection somewhere there between identity and kind of intimacy and sharing, and what does it mean to meet each other and to live in community.
Well, isn't that where art comes in, right? Because insofar as you're talking about this, there are these two lives, mine and yours. There's an intersection, and I want to create a sense that there is, like, we're not the same person, but I don't want to create a boundary and say, here's me, hard line, here's you. Isn't art really then the way we construct those gates and do that landscaping to create that sense of invitation between lives? That ends up being what art is, this sort of invitation to move back and forth between one life and the other. And that's why you want to do it with, well-craftedness, because I want to walk through that gate, as opposed to a gate you're like, I don't want to walk through that gate. like I'm not interested in that gate. But to do it well, to do it beautifully, invites others into your space, and then maybe even inspires them to do some work on their own gates and their own landscaping.
I have asked if you give me a dream. I am always noisy, always clamoring. When I am asleep, still I am with you. I asked you for.
We're talking about, like, moving away, kind of, not away from, but talking about like the lines or the boundaries between different lives, and that art ends up being then potentially, at least in this image, a way in which we create, we curate the space between lives. And
man, I love that analogy, because it makes me think, like, when you were saying, okay, so if I think about how I've been, like, I have close friends that would characterize me as a pretty open person. Like, I'm pretty inviting to neighbors, or to, like, in friendship or in conversation. And that makes me think, so the art that we make, and each of us individually, if you think of it as like a row of houses, and each one has a garden out front, and like you said, landscaping and all that. I wonder if some people just have like a longer front yard, like a bigger space where you can come way in and see more. So if you're an artist and you're making art, that space represents like a pretty large playground for people to come in and to spend time, and it would have a certain color and mood, and it's going to look different than the next person, because the way we would build that out is going to be unique and particular to how we're wired and what we've seen and what we've experienced in our lives, and what we've done with those experiences. And so, maybe some people, their house is like, it's like a big gate, and there's like, it takes something, you got to know the secret handshake to get past the front gate. And then for other people, there's just kind of a long, big front yard that you can run around in. And I could imagine like that analogy really working for thinking about visual artists that I love, or musicians, or, I don't know. of course it breaks down at some point, but
Yeah, because also there are also those friends for whom there's like, it's just a property and a tent. That's all. It's just a property and there's a tent in the middle. You're like,
a movable tent.
like, I know you intend that to be really welcoming. I'm just telling you it's awkward for everyone else.
That's right.
So
That's
true.
Oh, I feel like I've been trampled by a tempest. I've been holding up the last of my defenses. Rise up, oh my soul. Love is letting go.
So in the art that you're creating, a phrase that you've used, and insofar as you're kind of curating space between your life and other people's lives, but also giving people language for their own curation, you've used the word sacred art or sacred music a couple of times that you and I have spoken about, and I'd love for you to vamp a little bit, because I had this conversation with Audrey Assad during season 2 about like sacred music and like, is it dangerous to start talking about what's sacred and what's not sacred, because then you start drawing lines between things. But your more recent projects, the last 2, have bent a little bit more towards more liturgical music, more like stuff that would more traditionally be recognized, I guess, as sacred music. Is there a line for you? Like, is there a is there a line for you? Like, what's sacred music for you? Yeah, maybe that's the question. It's like, when you talk about sacred music, like, what is that that you're making?
Yeah.
That you would call sacred?
Well, I would probably answer that question different ways over, like if you asked me that 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And on one, like fundamentally, I would say all of life is sacred as it is touched by God, and so I would hesitate to, even just theologically, I would not want to make a distinction between sacred and non-sacred, and especially in artistic expression, when you think about like in our field where it's like, oh well, this song is a Christian song,
right? Because that's the same danger.
Non-Christian song. It's like just these these distinctions between the two can be really problematic. But I think as I've grown and gone through different seasons of art making, in the last 2 or 3 projects, Psalms, God's Highway, and then Steadfast Live, these 3 have been based around texts from the Psalms, from the scriptures themselves. So I've kind of borrowed words and given my own voice and my own, like, this is how I'm borrowing these words, but they're very much speaking on my behalf how I see the world,
Right.
So
yeah. Because it's a tradition that's lent you language. So you're borrowing it to some degree for use, but also like, this is a place where the psalmist, whichever psalmist has actually helped you curate your own front yard and space.
Yeah.
And you're passing that on.
And to stay with that analogy, I would say what I've discovered in exploring some of that creatively, like writing songs about all kinds of things, and then writing songs from David's words, and then I would say what I've discovered is that these songs are as far up close to the house as you can get for me. They're so core to how I'm wired and to how I feel like I'm it's just from such a deep place within me, and that's come out of some suffering, and that's part of it, but it's not all of it. And so I wonder if sacred art is actually the art that's up close to the house. And sometimes it comes out overtly like, these are spiritual words, from an ancient tradition. But interestingly, I have an album coming out in February 14th, that it's like the B-sides from Psalms. It's not really B-sides. It's called Songs from the Valley. But these are my own narrative songs, my own words around, but they were written at the same time as the Songs from the Psalms record. And so I think also, even though they're telling my story in different vocabulary or a different context, they feel like they're also sacred music because they're really close up to the house. And I think, what I'm drawn to in music in general, when I listen to Leonard Cohen, when I listen to Bob Dylan, when I listen to some of the things Joni Mitchell, like that I love at such a core level, I think sacred music is the stuff that's so close to to our hearts and to our primal experience of a human emotion. And that's not to say it's better but it just has a different resonance. And that would say also maybe there's some art that's being made that's closer to the curb, closer to the entryway, and that stuff is like really fun to listen to, and it maybe serves other purposes. It's entertainment. It's it has other functions, all of which are to be celebrated as well. But maybe sacred art, in this analogy of neighborhoods, is the stuff.
No, I love that.
Close to the house.
Because what it does is it takes like a project like Steadfast Live, and we can call this sacred to some degree because of its intention, but more so because of where it's rooted in your life. If that's what, ultimately, if that's what we're saying, that like the sacred nature of a thing has, and this might be a little bit dangerous to say, but has more to do with not particularly the content or expression, but the place, the rooted place it comes from in a human life, which then means like a project like Steadfast Live shares, which I think it does, shares a kind of sacred resonance with a project like, you mentioned Cohen. Like You Want It Darker. Dang, if that's not a sacred work of art, I don't know what it is. But that's not anything that anyone's gonna like identify, from a religious setting as like, here's sacred work.
Here's some
like here's some music for your religious Sunday practice. But it is a sacred work because it's rooted in this, like the fear of his own death and like the re-examination of his own human life. I think that's a great analogy. The sacred work is stuff that is maybe built or curated much closer to the house. I think that's strong.
Which makes me ask the question, and I've never really thought about this, but it makes me ask the question of, if that's true, and getting up close to the house is like, for me as an artist, a real a value of mine. Like I think it's valuable. I think it feels like, man, I want to do that with my life. I want to make things that bring people up close. And if that's true, then maybe art and this front yard and this landscape of art and life that we are curating for ourselves, each of us, even if we're not musicians, if that's true, then maybe the idea that God wants to be up close with us is pretty central to why we make things at all. If it's not about, is this churchy or does this fit in a Sunday service? Is this religious? Is this okay? Is this safe for the whole family? Whatever those phrases are.
Yes.
Maybe the objective is not to go that route and to analyze it with that kind of a filter, but maybe the idea is just to be up close, and that if God wants to be close with us, we invite others to be close with us, that the desire for communion and for real connection with him and with each other is maybe the invitation of art when it's done in that way.
I love that. I think it's a great place to land the plane too. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate the space.
Thanks,
I'm glad
Justin.
we had to put some work in to make this happen, but
I know, I'm so sorry.
It's you and I both.
Feet. But well
worth it.
I'm so glad. I always enjoy talking. I really do.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you for listening to this episode of the At Sea podcast. If you'd like to follow up with Sandra, you can check out her work at sandramccracken.com. That's with 2 C's, by the way, McCracken, MCCRACKEN. Once you're there, you'll discover links to her most recent collection of songs called Songs from the Valley. All of the music from this episode, all the buffers between segments, are actually clips from songs on that collection. It's beautiful. I think you'll really enjoy it. You can follow up with us and the At Sea Podcast by visiting atseapodcast.com. And you can always find me at justinmcroberts.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast and you would like to join the small army of folks who continue to make this happen, just jump to patreon.com, Patreon, patreon.com, and search my name, Justin McRoberts, or At Sea Podcast. Join us as we lift up and highlight the works of women and men who are actively creating spaces and places for what comes next with regards to the practice of faith, community, art, and a fully flourishing human life. Until next time.